So, in particular, with what we've heard from this morning, and what are the on-farm consequences, and I suppose reflecting more on the work from the biological function of the soil, if you're able to lead us in discussion with that, Walter.
Right. Thank you very much. And this is really the fundamental point. I mean, John and Charles basically sort of outlined, yes, this is the challenge we've got, but really we've got to get it back to, well, what has happened, how has this occurred, but more specifically, what is it that we can do practically, profitably, naturally to turn that around? Because in a sense, it's about farmers having the viability to make the change and, of course, to bring this whole thing back to health. And I think we'll be talking about a lot of the details, the science and what have you behind that, but really I think it's that simple matter. We've got to get back to the basics of, well, how did nature create these systems? How come we did evolve and have that nutritional integrity and health growing on these natural systems? What have we done to change those? And of course, how do we actually turn that around? The consequences of this, of course, are everywhere. In a sense, the biggest fact is not just how much food we can grow, and we'll talk a bit more about the numbers and options there, but really it's the quality of the food that we do grow and the nutritional integrity of the food that we are growing and its consequences. And I mean, Amanda has raised this, but it's fundamental because basically we have a exponential increase in a whole series of self-induced diseases. You know, whether it's diabetes, whether it's obesity, whether it's cancers, whether it's cardiac arrest, immune deficiencies, you name it. And these diseases have all been growing exponentially throughout the Western world at 5 to 8% rates. And of course, if you grow things exponentially at 5%, it's doubling every 10 years. And in a sense, we're getting to the point that unless we address these nutritional integrity consequences, we won't have to worry about 2050 at all, because we won't be there as a functional society. There are 7 missed meals between social stability and crises. And in a sense, John in his studies at the strategic level sees that whether it's in North Africa, the Arab Spring, Russia or whatever. 7 missed meals between social stability and social collapse. And we're seeing that with the tsunami in Indonesia now, how few days is required before things become dysfunctional. And so we're going to have up to 10 billion people on this planet by 2050, UN figures. Okay, and the question is, unless we find a way to provide food quantity, but most importantly that nutritional health, integrity, quality, we are facing a major challenge. So we'll talk about the details of that later.
Thanks, Walter. I suppose in terms of what what we perceive in terms of the consequences that happen on farm, we really see what happens above the surface, but going below the surface and our practices in terms of what we do. I mean, that's is that something you want to go on into later as part of that discussion?
Well, yeah, let's go and do the workshop that details later, but obviously, very, very simply, everything relates to the soil. Everything relates to then basically how those plants are grown, and in a sense how those plants can access the essential nutrients. All of us, all life depends on some 50 essential elements from the periodic table for our biochemistry. Those nutrients can only come from the soil. And whether we get those nutrients depends on how our soils are grown. So it's all about the soil. The powerful thing is we are responsible, but we are also response-able. We have the agency through wise land management to take control of this and to solve this elegantly.
Thanks, Walter. Well, that's probably really good to hand over to you, Di, to talk about in terms of the on-farm consequences and some of the dilemmas, but also some of the things that you've been able to do to address these issues yourself. Do you want to share some of those?
Yeah, I guess when you're talking about those things, Walter, about the whole way the soil's functioning and getting the right appropriate nutrients and balance into the food that we're producing, I guess I've been in the fortunate position of seeing these things occurring with our livestock program. As we've been working together with improving the soil health, improving the microbial function, which I'll talk about later on this afternoon, but just seeing those outcomes in the animal health down to the point, and we'll be talking about food wastage, excess consumption, having to produce more and more and more to feed a population. But when those foods are grown with the appropriate nutrition, then the consumption rates required to achieve the levels we need to maintain health are far lower. And why I'm saying that is I've just seen that in the sheep, and particularly rams, as Charlie will well know, when you're running a stud, the rams themselves have high needs for food to maintain the growth rates that they have and their production. And typically a ram will do a fairly decent size manure, but once you've got the land functioning and all the nutrient density back into those plants, they end up with a very small manure. So you can see quickly how much energy efficiency those animals have through the nutritional capacity of the soil's capacity to provide that nutrition into the plants. They can sleep longer, they're not having to walk around chasing food all the time, and it changes the whole aspect of how those animals function, and that's what we've got to try and get into the human food chain, so that that food that they're eating is of optimum nutritional specifications, I guess, and some of it we probably aren't really fully aware of, but being able to see that in the livestock and just the optimum health, and it comes down to that whole immune system functioning right from the soil through the plants and into the animals, and then we've got to transfer that to the humans by enabling the appropriate food choices.
Fantastic, and and I know you've also had some pretty remarkable outcomes from those in terms of being able to deal, getting onto new country with histories of sort of, I'll refer to it as mainstream land management. But you've had some really good outcomes in a very short time frame in terms of being able to arrest some of those sort of engineered inputs. Did you want to sort of share any information on that as well?
I'll probably touch a bit after lunch on that, but I think, just the keys being the livestock and that microbial system within their gut, and being able to transfer that then from farms that we've been working on for a period of time onto new ground, which might have a seriously degraded history, and reinstigating that microbial community into the soil and enabling it to get started.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Di. And I might ask Charlie if we sort of talked about the on-farm consequences in your presentation, but about that shift and how we've got something that's been happening for quite a while, which has had a significant impact globally, not just at the farm on-farm level, but right throughout our entire supply chain and affecting us further. Can you expand on that for us?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. I'll just preface that with I wrote a chapter in my book about the Haggerty's work, and Di is too modest to say it, but what they've developed for broadacre agriculture using the same equipment is absolutely a world breakthrough, focusing on biological replacements for the industrial process. So she won't say just how good it is, but I hope she describes exactly what they're doing. In answer to what was in the program, what would I like to see, and I'll just touch on one thing. Imagine if we had, and I was talking to Amanda about this, if we had an instrument better than a Brix meter. Imagine walking down a Woolies or a Coles, well, I shouldn't mention names, big retailers' shelves, and then going to the local real food market that's going to develop here, where you've got food off truly healthy soil, and seeing the difference in the readings. It'd be a game changer. So the thing I thought, just talking briefly with Justin, that I can probably just put in front of you, because I'm going to talk after lunch about the really exciting stuff on some of the case studies in regenerative ag. So I'll finish with one more shot over our collective bows. which is the issue of glyphosate, the world's most widely used herbicide, weedicide, nearly 1 million tonnes going out per year now. Not necessarily in some respects the most dangerous chemical, although we're now finding out how dangerous it is, but it's certainly the most widespread. And my information comes from increasing research. I recently did a couple of sessions at a Byron Bay Literary Festival with a woman called Carey Gillam. She's been a Reuters reporter for 20 years and has spent about 10 years investigating, I won't use the names of the big companies, but the cover-ups on their cancer research and the impacts on human health, etc., that's been covered up at length. She's got a book called Whitewash that's just out. And then I've done a couple of gigs around Melbourne, including out at the food centre, the regional food centre at Dalesford, with a guy called Jonathan Latham, who used to work as a GM scientist for the big companies, then got alarmed and moved over using his scientific knowledge to expose what's happening through things like GM. And then he got rung up by a woman who had spent 15 years using freedom of information and whistleblowers to gather something like 10,000 documents just showing how the cover-ups occurred in the States and how the big regulatory authorities don't even do the testing on the new chemicals. They rely on the Monsantos and others to do it. So that's the preface to just some stuff I'll put in front of you. Two of the world's leading soil scientists out of the States, one well into his 80s, Don Huber, has now been talking for a long while from his extraordinary technical ability on the dangers of glyphosate, the way it's particularly harming the soil biology, that their capacity to work, and then linking that to the way it is getting into our food. And then Robert Kramer used to work for the Department of Ag in the States, obviously didn't retain his job because he got more and more alarmed about the impact on soil biology of glyphosate. So just very quickly to finish, we now know it's when they're testing industrial foods, it's in most of those foods, the broad cereals right through, particularly the GM crops where they're tending to use more and more of it, particularly even at harvest. The humans they're testing in industrial societies, the test rates are coming up at least a third. We've got glyphosate in it, even in breast milk. And to summarise quickly, and you need to look at people like Dr. Zach Bush in the States, who's working with, he's had a lifetime in autism, but he's working with scientists now looking at the microbial world and its parallels to the soil biology. But to summarise glyphosate's impact on human health, and obviously animal and others, it has two key functions that's appearing. When we ingest it, it gets into our gut microbiome, and it's interfering with a key amino acid pathway that's integral to our immune system. It's chopping it off at a key level, and part of that is its role. It was discovered as a cleansing agent for rusted pipes. It's what's called a chemical chelator. It grabs key minerals and locks them out. That's why your Roundup spray paddock will go yellow. So imagine when that gets into our gut microbiome. The second key factor is it's water soluble. And the testing in the States shows it's in the underground, surface water, it evaporates. Organic farmers are finding contamination through rainfall, etc. Gets into our body, we're now finding, the research is showing it crosses our gut lining, a key protective barrier, crossing the blood-brain barrier, and evidence increasingly that it's crossing placental and other delicate membranes. And you can extrapolate some of the correlations with both the mental and biophysical diseases, but I guess what I'm saying, the evidence is mounting that this is another DDT, silent spring 2, if we're not careful. We're still using it a bit in spot spraying. Most of our agriculture is still predicated on it in cropping. And I think we want to keep our eye on this because Monsanto's just lost a big court case and there's another 18,000 lined up for that 400 million and this thing is going to get going. We could all be dragged down by it if we're not careful. So we know we can now farm biologically without it. As the Haggertys and others are doing, and it'd be remiss of me not to at least put it on your radar.
Thanks, Charlie. And it's a good point there that there are a lot of demonstrated practice of not having to use a whole range of engineered inputs. Di, yourself and Ian, for one. but it doesn't necessarily have to fall into the organic category either. So, we're not, doesn't necessarily mean we've got to swing from one right across the other end of the spectrum in that, but I dare say you'll allude to that a bit later on as well. Walter, did you want to add any more in regards to microbial function and on the back of what Charlie was saying as well?
No, look, let's talk about that as we develop the case or the illustration, and then we'll get into that again in much detail.
Good, okay. Well, the panel here, if you had nothing more that you wanted to add to that, we're going to ask that people, any questions that you have, so that we can actually keep the momentum going, is that you put the questions to the phone number, to the text number. We open that gate, you look out, everyone will come charging through it. But so if you can address your questions to the text number that's on the wall or on your tables, and then we will be addressing those questions later.